Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Housing Ombudsman Service Casework Conversations podcast. I'm Victoria King, one of the sector learning and development leads here at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and today I'm joined by Gillian Robinson, who is an adjudicator in one of our dispute resolution teams, and we're going to be talking about a no maladministration case that Gillian worked on last year. You might remember Gillian from a previous podcast, but Gillian, thanks for coming back. Thanks for doing a podcast with us again, and to talk about this case. Before we go into the nuances of the case, could you please tell us a bit about you and what you do here at the Housing Ombudsman Service?
Hi, Victoria. Thanks for having me back on the pod. It's lovely to be here. I've been working at the Ombudsman for just over 2 years now as an adjudicator. I investigate complaints that have exhausted a landlord's internal complaints process. I carry out impartial investigations. So in each case, I consider all the evidence provided by the resident who's complained and also by their landlord. I examine this evidence and I compare it against legal and policy requirements to decide if the landlord has acted reasonably or not. I then issue a decision on behalf of the Ombudsman. So my decision will explain whether I think the landlord got things wrong, and if so, what it needs to do to put things right. Or alternatively, it might explain that I'm happy the landlord has acted appropriately.
So we're here today to talk about a no maladministration case that you investigated last year, so in 2025, and the complaint was about damp in a home. Could you tell us a bit more about the background to the case before it came to us to investigate?
Yes, this case involved a complaint about the landlord's handling of damp in a property. It was from a resident who was registered blind. It was back in August 2023, and his carer pointed out to him that there were signs of damp on some internal walls inside his house. The resident reported this to the landlord and it responded quickly. Within 2 weeks, it had carried out a full damp survey, which confirmed there was damp in the walls of the downstairs of the property and it was coming up from the ground. It said to fix this, it would inject a damp-proof membrane into the walls. However, before it could go ahead and do that work, the resident complained. He wasn't happy because the landlord had carried out previous damp-proofing works in 2010 and 2018. So that would be 13 and 5 years previously. And he wasn't happy that that damp-proofing work hadn't prevented the damp from reoccurring then in 2023. So the landlord investigated that through its complaints process, and in its complaint responses, it acknowledged that the previous damp-proofing works hadn't been successful. It said it didn't know the reason for this, and it explained quite often damp can come from multiple sources, and sometimes it can be a process of elimination before it's fully resolved. It said it would carry out the further damp-proofing works as soon as possible to resolve the issue, and it apologised to the resident because it recognised that would be inconvenient to him. However, by the time it was issuing its final complaint response, this was in the September 2023, the resident had given notice to end his tenancy and he was preparing to move out within a matter of weeks. So given this, he said to the landlord that he would prefer it not to go ahead and carry out the damp-proofing works until after he moved out, and the landlord agreed to that. So the resident did move out then in October 2023, but he still wanted us to investigate his complaint. And that was because he was worried that the landlord wasn't doing enough to support blind or visually impaired residents. He said he felt it should have been more proactive in identifying that there was damp in his property and that he shouldn't have had to rely on his carer to bring it to his attention.
Thank you for that. So to summarise, the resident reported that his carer had spotted damp in the walls of his home in early 2023, and then shortly after that he raised the complaint about the situation, given the landlord had in recent years carried out 2 damp treatments. The landlord issued its stage 2 complaint response in mid-September 2023, and following this the resident contacted us to investigate. So before we discuss what you found, what was the scope of the investigation? What elements were we able to look at as an ombudsman? Because the resident had asked us to investigate a previous issue before this, hadn't he?
Yes, The resident also told us he was unhappy with how the landlord had communicated with him as a blind tenant over the course of his 20-year tenancy. It had agreed reasonable adjustments with him previously in relation to how it would communicate with him and how it would arrange appointments. And he'd raised another formal complaint earlier in 2023 about specific incidents where he said it hadn't complied with the reasonable adjustments. We looked into that complaint and investigated it, and we had just completed our investigation a few weeks before I began my investigation. So in that completed investigation, we found that there were some instances where the landlord hadn't complied with the reasonable adjustments, although through its complaint process it had acknowledged, apologised and compensated the resident for that. So therefore, in that investigation, we found it had provided reasonable redress to the complaint, although we recommended it consider delivering training to staff on managing reasonable adjustments. So then when the resident made the second complaint in August 2023, he brought up reasonable adjustments again, but he didn't actually refer to any specific incidents where it hadn't complied with reasonable adjustments. He just referred more generally to not being happy with its communications with him over the entire 20-year period of his tenancy. Now, we would not expect a landlord to investigate such a broad and non-specific complaint dating back that far. So we explained that to him, that we couldn't investigate that. But of course, I did consider whether the landlord complied with the reasonable adjustments in the context of its response to the August 2023 damp reports, which is what I was investigating. It was just that I couldn't investigate all its dealing with the resident over the previous 20 years.
Thank you for clarifying that, Gillian. So can you tell us what you did find in your investigation?
I found there was no maladministration in this case. The landlord responded as it should and in line with its damp and mould policy when it received the resident's report about damp in his property. It initially came out and inspected the property 6 days after the resident reported the issue, and it then followed this up and carried out a more detailed damp survey the next week. So its initial response, I found, was prompt and it was thorough. Then through that damp survey, it identified the works that were required to resolve the issue, and it was prepared to carry that work out almost immediately. But it was the resident that asked it to hold off until after he'd moved out. So at this point, I think it was late August, he hadn't actually officially handed in his notice to end the tenancy yet, but he knew it was going to be imminent. So the landlord did discuss workaround options with him. It said it could put him into temporary accommodation while it carried out the work, or if he wanted to stay in the property, it could try and work around him. But he was adamant that he didn't want the work to go ahead until after he moved out, and he then did hand in his notice in September that he was going to move out in October. So given this and the fact the landlord did also do a risk assessment and look at the work required, and it didn't consider there was any immediate risk to the resident. It thought the work was routine. So given that, combined with the fact the resident was moving out in a matter of weeks anyway, I thought it was reasonable that it agreed to defer the works. Really, that decision was made in the interests of minimising disruption to the resident and respecting his wishes. So for all those reasons, I found no maladministration in the case.
So we've said for years here at the Housing Ombudsman Service that landlords should have a zero tolerance approach to damp and mould. It should never be dismissed as a lifestyle issue, as it can be really serious to health, a really serious health risk. In this case, the resident was vulnerable. He was blind and couldn't see the damp, and his carer had to tell him it was there. Could you tell us about how the landlord considered the resident's circumstances and tailored its service to the resident based on his individual needs?
Well, the landlord did have some reasonable adjustments in place with the resident, although these related more to how it would communicate with them. And it was also things such as when its operatives or contractors were going to attend his property, they would ring him in advance to let him know that they were on their way. But in terms of actually helping him identify repair issues within the property, the landlord didn't have any special arrangements in place for the resident. It did inspect his property in the same way as it would with any resident, in that it would have responded to reports of repair issues. It said it had trained all its staff and contractors to report any signs of damp they spotted in residents' homes, and it also carried out stock condition surveys of its properties every 5 years, and its stock condition surveys of his property were up to date. The landlord thought those arrangements were working okay for the resident because he hadn't actually asked it to ever make any adjustments in terms of inspections. It knew he had a carer. He had been reporting numerous other repair issues in his property in the past, so it didn't think he needed any additional support with that. So I didn't think it was unreasonable that it hadn't put any specific arrangement in place for inspecting the property due to him being blind. And I suppose with landlords, when they're considering reasonable adjustments, it really is a balancing act. Ultimately, they do need to respect residents' autonomy. They shouldn't make an assumption based on a disability that someone's going to be less able to look after their property or report issues, for example, just because they have a disability. However, the important thing really is that they let residents know what support options are available, and they let residents know that they can amend reasonable adjustments at any time, or they can put new reasonable adjustments in place at any time. And I felt the landlord had done that in this case. It was evident it had had a number of discussions with him previously about reasonable adjustments, and it had no reason to think he needed that extra support with identifying issues in his property. Now, of course, once he complained, and he complained about the fact it hadn't provided that extra support to him, I would have expected the landlord to consider options for helping him out in the future, but for the fact he was moving out of the property anyway, so it wasn't necessary.
So in September 2024, the landlord created a policy called Treating Customers with Fairness and Respect, and the purpose of that policy was to provide a focus on residents with vulnerabilities or residents who might need extra support or additional support. And in that policy, there's a section about reasonable adjustments, and that's a really positive step, and it shows that the landlord's learning from things, that things are occurring, and it's recognizing that it needs to take those appropriate steps and consider reasonable adjustments in the future. And I'm bringing that up because, as you mentioned earlier, we also investigated a case from the same landlord a few weeks before this one. And in that other complaint, it was about how the landlord handled agreed reasonable adjustments when staff need to access residents' property. And in that determination, we recommended that the landlord carries out staff training on managing reasonable adjustments to help prevent future errors in relation to agreed reasonable adjustments not being adhered to. So we're in March 2026 now. We're now past the end of October 2025, and phase 1 of OAB's law has come in. So with damp cases and emergency hazards, they now need to be fixed within 24 hours, and significant damp and mould hazards must be investigated within 10 working days and then made safe within 5 working days. And if the home can't be made safe in that time, then the landlord needs to provide suitable temporary accommodation. If this case were to happen now, what steps and considerations would the landlord have to have taken to comply with that law?
Well, in this particular case, I don't think AWAB's law would have really changed much or made the landlord have to do anything different than it had already done. It responded really promptly to the residents' reports. It used a suitably qualified person to come out and survey the damp and identify what work was needed to address it. It risk assessed the damp and the works needed just to check there was no imminent risk of harm to the resident. Even though it decided the work was routine rather than urgent, it was still prepared to carry out the work straight away. The only reason it didn't was because the resident asked it not to. And its communications with him were really good, as was its record keeping. So it was already ticking all the boxes of what landlords are required to do now AWAB's law is in force. I can think of a few other damp and mould cases I've dealt with lately where AWAB's law could have made such a positive difference had it been enforced when the issues arose. In those cases, the landlords delayed in responding to reports of damp and mould. They didn't carry out thorough investigations. They either didn't treat the problem at all, or they took too long to treat it, and they didn't keep residents informed about their findings or next steps. So these are all the sorts of things that Awaab's law addresses, and landlords have a really clear framework now that they have to comply with, and we can and we will be holding them accountable against that.
So back to this case now, and reflecting on this case, what stood out for you?
Even though the landlord handled this case well, it still took learning from it. It told us it used that learning to reflect on its practices and to inform its approach around supporting vulnerable residents. It was only a year after the residents' complaint that it then introduced a new policy on treating residents with fairness and respect. So I think that in some ways the resident got the outcome that he told us he wanted, which was that the landlord reflected and improved on how it supported disabled residents.
Thank you, Gillian. So our Ombudsman, Richard Blakeway, also looked at this case and he commented on it and he said, the resident escalated their complaint because they were concerned about other visually impaired residents experiencing issues. Whilst the landlord's overall handling of the complaint was effective, it still used the case to develop ways of working with residents with additional needs, and this shows a positive and proactive approach to learning from complaints. So that brings us to the end of this Casework Conversations podcast. So thank you so much for your time today, Gillian. And thank you to those who have listened to this podcast. You can find out more about our decisions on our website, www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. And if you are a member landlord of the Housing Ombudsman Scheme, you can also get exclusive access to our Centre for Learning Landlord Hub, details of which you can also find on our website under the Centre for Learning tab at the top of the page. So thank you very much, Gillian.
Thanks very much, Victoria.